In the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, where mist clings to the earth like memory itself, there stood a town barely known beyond the mountains, Bellevue. It was 1823, and the people there were simple. Farmers, blacksmiths, storekeepers, their days were ruled by the rising and setting sun, and their lives woven tightly with old-world values, prayer, and routine. In towns like Bellevue, silence was a virtue, privacy a right. But there was one family whose silence seemed to demand more than respected invited fear. The Galloways had lived on the outskirts of Bellevue for decades. Their home, large and shadowed, sat beside the graveyard like a loyal dog beside its master. It was also where they operated their trade, Galloway Funeral and Burial Services, the only mortuary for miles around. Generations of Bellevue's dead were laid to rest by their hands. The father, Gideon Galloway, ran the business with his wife, Temperance, a pale woman whose voice was rarely heard. They had 2 sons, Abel, the eldest, always seen with books under his arm, and Jonah, whose silence could chill the air around him. The Galloways were known not for what they said, but for how they made people feel. It wasn't hatred or even distrust. It was more like a curtain between them and the rest of the world, a boundary no one crossed. They didn't attend festivals, didn't break bread with neighbors, and never spoke of anything unrelated to death. Gideon was a precise man, always dressed in black. He quoted scripture but never smiled. He buried the town's loved ones with skill and ritual, yet his eyes seemed to hold no empathy, only order, and yet no one dared speak ill of them. Because when death came, and it always came, the Galloways were there, and they did their job well. But strange things were always whispered behind closed doors. Old women would murmur about how the Galloway boys hadn't aged in 10 years. Children would say the Galloway house was alive, that they saw flickers of candlelight through the windows at midnight when no one should be awake. Farmhands returning home late claimed to hear organ music drifting from the house, eerie and soft, with no explanation. Still, life in Bellevue was hard, and no one had time to chase ghosts. Besides, what would they do without the Galloways? Then, things began to unravel slowly, like a frayed rope that no one noticed until it was too late. The first to disappear was Anna Murphy, a young girl whose mother had died of consumption. She had gone to the Galloways to prepare her mother's final arrangements. She never came home. The Galloways claimed she never arrived, but her cousin swore she had seen Anna walking the road toward the funeral home. People grew uncomfortable, but they reasoned maybe she ran off. People did that sometimes, right? A few weeks later, a traveler named Ezekiel Boone passed through Bellevue. He was known for keeping notes of his journey, which he shared at the inn's fireplace. One morning, the townsfolk found his belongings still in his room, but he was gone. No signs of struggle, just gone. He had visited the Galloways the evening before, asking for directions to Harrisburg. They said they never saw him. Now, a small town can tolerate a little darkness, especially when it sits so close to death. But disappearances are hard to forget. Still, the Galloways continued their work. Death came and they handled it. Bodies buried, prayers whispered. No one else wanted the job, and that was the truth. The Galloways did what no one else wanted to do. They carried the weight of grief, the smell of decay. That alone kept them safe from too many questions, and in a time before fingerprinting, before telegraphs, before forensics, questions were the only weapon a person had. Sheriff Elias Cobb began to take notice. He was a quiet man himself, but the Galloways troubled him in a way he couldn't shake. He started keeping a ledger of all those who'd gone missing, not just in Bellevue, but in nearby towns too. He saw a pattern. All had visited the Galloways, some to arrange burials, others just passing through, and yet no one in town would stand with him. Fear can be subtle. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it looks like polite smiles and avoiding eye contact. That was Bellevue, a town that had grown used to silence, and a family that used it to hide something unspeakable. But silence, like soil, cannot bury the truth forever. Soon the Galloways would learn that even the dead speak, if you dare to listen. Sheriff Elias Cobb had always believed in trusting people until they gave him reason not to. But when enough shadows fell in the same direction, even a trusting man must light a lantern, and the shadows in Bellevue were all falling toward the Galloway funeral home. Elias wasn't a man prone to superstition, but he was a man of patterns, of small observations. He remembered the name of every traveler who passed through Bellevue, every face that wandered into town, and every soul who left, either by wagon or by casket. And he started to realize that not all who came through Bellevue ever left. It started with Anna Murphy, the girl who vanished after visiting the Galloways, then the traveler Ezekiel Boone, whose absence gnawed at Elias's sense of order. At first, he told himself maybe it was a coincidence. People disappeared sometimes. There were rivers to fall into, bears in the woods, and the ever-present urge for some to just vanish. But the thing that disturbed him was not that they disappeared. It was where they were last seen. He needed facts, not feelings, not fear, proof. So he started a ledger. Late at night, by candlelight, in the small office behind the town jailhouse, Elias began writing. He opened a page and titled it, Galloway Suspicion Missing Persons Log. It was quiet work, lonely work, and dangerous work in a town where silence was sacred. He noted every disappearance, every funeral, and every odd occurrence tied to the Galloway home going back nearly 15 years. What shocked him was the frequency. People assumed it was just the age they lived in. Harsh winters, deadly fevers, travelers lost to the elements. But Elias saw the pattern, the connections. People disappeared after funerals. Women, especially young women, those who had no family or who were mourning and alone. It was too many, and every one of them had walked into the Galloway funeral home, but suspicion wasn't evidence. He tried to ask questions, subtle ones, quiet ones. He asked the pastor who presided over many of the burials whether he ever saw the bodies once the Galloways had them. The pastor, a nervous man, simply said, "They handled everything before I arrived. I just did the prayers." He asked the grave digger, who scratched his beard and muttered, "Some of them coffins felt light, real light, but who's to question death?" He asked Doc Harris, the old town physician, if he ever signed death certificates for the people buried by the Galloways. Doc blinked and said Gideon usually handled the paperwork, said it was a family process, a sacred ritual. A sacred ritual, that phrase bothered Elias more than anything. What kind of sacred ritual demanded secrecy from every other living soul? Then one night he got his break. He was walking near the Galloway property just past dusk. The trees cast long shadows, and the smell of damp earth clung to the air. He wasn't spying, he told himself, just walking. But then he saw something through the cracks of the old funeral barn's door. Light movement and something else. A figure dragging a large sack. It was Jonah Galloway. Elias crouched low, watching from the darkness. Jonah lifted the sack, heavy, and placed it on a table. The candlelight flickered as Gideon entered, whispering words Elias couldn't make out. They worked in silence, but with precision. Too much precision. Elias returned home that night shaken. He didn't sleep. He just opened his ledger and wrote, "They're hiding something, something foul. I need to find a body before they make it disappear too." He knew he had to dig literally. But that would mean digging up the graves the Galloways had buried, and that in Bellevue was practically heresy. So Elias made a decision. He would do it himself, quietly. He would start with Sarah Tomlinson, a young woman who had died unexpectedly last month. Her only family, a brother, was away in the military. No one would notice. Under the cover of night, Elias and the gravedigger, whom he had finally convinced with whispered warnings and promises of protection, dug up her plot. With shaking hands, Elias pried open the coffin. It was empty, no body, no clothes, just stones. The gravedigger fell to his knees. Elias said nothing. He just stared into the hollow box where a young woman should have rested. It was no longer a question. The Galloways weren't just undertakers. They were hiding bodies or taking them, or something worse. The time for quiet suspicion was over. Elias didn't yet know how deep the horror went, but he knew this. The Galloways were not what they seemed. And Bellevue was no longer just a quiet town. It was a town haunted by the living. It was nearly midnight when Thomas Reed, the longtime gravedigger of Bellevue, sat alone on the back porch of his small cabin at the edge of town. The wind rustled the trees, and the lantern beside him flickered with a weak, dying flame. His hands were trembling, not from age, but from the weight of something he'd been carrying for too long. Thomas had buried the people of Bellevue for more than 20 years. He had seen the sorrow of families, the cruelty of fevers, and the stillness of lifeless bodies lowered into the earth. But something had been gnawing at him, something he'd chosen to ignore. He remembered the first time it felt wrong, even if he couldn't say it aloud back then. It was 8 years ago. A casket was delivered by Jonah Galloway himself. No family, no ceremony, just a box, a name carved into wood, and the instructions to bury it before dawn. "I'll say the prayers," Jonah had told him, his voice calm, polite. No need to trouble the pastor. Thomas obeyed. The Galloways were trusted, and truth be told, he didn't want to get involved in what he didn't understand. But when he lifted that casket, it didn't feel right. Too light, like it was filled with old clothes and not a human being. He told himself maybe the deceased was a child, or maybe he was losing his strength. That was the first time he buried an empty box. But it wasn't the last. Over the years there were more. Too many coffins that felt hollow, too many late-night burials, too many funerals without mourners. He asked questions once, just once, and Gideon Galloway smiled at him in a way that turned his stomach cold. "The dead don't talk, Mr. Reed, and neither should we." Thomas had held that silence like a cross on his back, until now. When Sheriff Elias Cobb came knocking, lantern in hand, Thomas was ready. He knew what Elias wanted to ask before he spoke a word. The sheriff's face was tight, drawn by sleepless nights and too many unanswered questions. But Thomas finally was ready to answer. "I've buried lies," Thomas said plainly, "and I'm done digging graves for ghosts." He confessed everything he'd held back. He spoke of the caskets that rattled like boxes of tools, not people. He told of the times he arrived to bury a body only to be told the body was already prepared and sealed. He recounted how, more than once, the pastor wasn't invited. And he shared how the Galloways kept meticulous control over every aspect of death in Bellevue. Elias listened in silence, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around the handle of his notebook. When Thomas finished, Elias asked him one question. "Do you think there's anyone actually buried in the last 10 graves you filled?" Thomas couldn't answer. He didn't want to know. That was the turning point. The sheriff gathered a few trusted men, quiet, cautious, and loyal. Men who had lost friends, wives, even children under strange circumstances. They all had one thing in common. They had trusted the Galloways. That trust was now shattered. Together, under the cover of night, they reopened the most recent graves. 3 were empty, 2 contained sacks of rocks. 1 held only a folded dress, not a single corpse. Not a single truth. Words spread slowly, then all at once. What had once been whispered suspicion turned into roaring panic. Townsfolk looked toward the Galloway funeral home with horror. Mothers held their children tighter. Widows wept at graves that now felt like cruel jokes. The quiet town of Bellevue was no longer innocent, but the Galloways, they remained calm. Gideon still walked with his polished cane. Jonah still fetched supplies in his wagon. Margaret Galloway still tended the flowers outside the funeral home, as if nothing had changed, as if no one had discovered their secret. Thomas, once silent, now stood firm. "I can't undo the holes I dug," he told the townspeople at the next gathering, "but I can stop digging new ones for people who don't deserve death." His regret became the town's first real clue, the spark that set justice in motion. His courage shattered the illusion that had cloaked the Galloway legacy for decades. He showed them that silence had been the Galloways' greatest weapon, and that truth was the only thing that could unearth the horror they'd buried for years. The townspeople, now awakened, wanted answers, but what they were about to discover beneath that funeral home would be far darker than anyone imagined. His name was Abel McCree, a tanner's apprentice from Philadelphia, journeying westward in the summer of 1823. He was just 21, full of ambition and naive optimism, hoping to find work or opportunity in the blossoming towns of Pennsylvania. He had no family left, just a backpack, a Bible, and a sturdy pair of boots worn thin from miles on the road. He reached Bellevue one quiet evening, drawn to the smell of firewood and the glow of lanterns in the windows. The town seemed sleepy, peaceful, and slow. He asked for a place to rest and was directed by a young boy to the Galloway funeral home, a strange suggestion, but Abel was too tired to question it. The boy had told him kindly, "They have rooms sometimes for travelers. Mr. Galloway helps folks who pass through." When he knocked, Margaret Galloway greeted him at the door with a soft smile and hands folded neatly in her apron. She offered him soup, a cot in a back room, and warm tea for the night. Grateful and unaware of the reputation whispered behind closed doors, Abel accepted without hesitation. He would regret it forever. He slept deeply for a few hours, but in the dead of night he awoke to a sound, a low dragging like something being hauled across stone. The room was freezing cold. He realized with an ache in his gut that there were no windows. Only a small oil lamp flickered above, casting shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. He rose, heart pounding, and walked toward the door. Locked, he wasn't a fool. He didn't scream or bang. He quietly examined the walls, ran his fingers along every board, and found a hairline seam. A panel, barely noticeable, just loose enough to slip a small object behind. He jammed the metal tip of his belt buckle in and pried until it opened to a narrow passage, not meant for people, likely a ventilation shaft or something worse. He crawled slowly, quietly. He moved through narrow darkness, breathing shallow, not knowing where it led. After what felt like hours, he emerged behind a curtain in a long room. The air was thick, the stench of death unmistakable. What he saw next would torment him for the rest of his life. The bone room, candles flickered around the walls, tables were stacked with human remains. Skulls, ribs, even full skeletons mounted like grotesque trophies. Some were sawed in half, others burned. Jars of preserved organs lined the shelves, names etched on wooden tags, dates, ages. It was a twisted museum of death. At the far end of the room, he saw Jonah Galloway, kneeling in front of a wooden slab, carefully sewing shut the lips of a corpse with black thread. Humming, smiling, Abel froze, then a noise, a creak underfoot. His own foot betrayed him. Jonah turned, their eyes met. Abel ran. He didn't know how he found the stairs or the door, but he burst through into the woods behind the house. He ran barefoot, branches slicing his skin, clothes tearing, but he didn't stop until he collapsed near the old riverbank miles from town. He hid in a hollow, doubt tree, bleeding and shaking until morning. When he crept back to the road, he flagged down a wagon driven by an old farmer named Samuel Brood, who took one look at Abel and said, "Son, looks like you've been through the devil's den." It would be weeks before Abel was well enough to speak clearly, and longer still before he could tell his story without trembling. He made it to Harrisburg, where he reported everything he'd seen. It took time for the authorities to listen. People thought him mad. But when news from Bellevue began to spread, his testimony became the final piece in the puzzle. Share if Elias Cobb made the journey himself to hear Abel's account. He survived something none of us could imagine, Elias would later say. He's the reason we had the courage to go further. Abel never returned to Bellevue. He later became a schoolteacher in Ohio, living a quiet life. But every spring, on the anniversary of his escape, he would light a candle and pray, not just for himself, but for the souls of those who never escaped that funeral home of horrors. His chilling testimony exposed the truth no one wanted to believe, that evil can wear a smile, serve you soup, and tuck you in for the night, all while planning your death, and sometimes it takes just one survivor to bring the darkness into the light. The summer of 1823 had been strangely silent in Bellevue, Pennsylvania. The sun baked the earth with little mercy, drying up the creeks and splitting the ground into 1,000 cracks. But on the night of August 3rd, the sky finally broke open. It was not just rain. It was a reckoning, a storm so violent it seemed as if the heavens had been storing their rage all season, waiting for just the right moment to unleash it. Lightning lit up the fields like midday sun. Thunder shattered the stillness and rolled across the mountains with the voice of judgment. The townsfolk hid in their homes, candles trembling in the wind, dogs howling, and babies crying. Shingles ripped off roofs, trees snapped like matchsticks, and down in the oldest part of Bellevue near the graveyard that bordered the Galloway funeral home, a secret long buried finally came to light. At the edge of the cemetery was a weeping willow, ancient and thick. Beneath its heavy limbs rested the grave of a young woman named Clara Whitcomb, buried nearly a year prior. Clara had no family left, and no one visited her grave anymore. She had been one of the Galloway's many quiet burials. No ceremony, no mourner, just a pine box and a receipt. That was how the Galloways preferred it, but the storm did something no man ever dared. As the rain hammered the earth and the thunder cracked open the sky, the roots of the old willow began to writhe and pull. The soil, soaked and shaken, gave way, and in the darkness, with no one to witness it at first, Clara's grave burst open. The next morning, it was Harlan Pritchard, the town's caretaker and gravedigger, who found it. His boots squished in the mud as he approached what he thought was just another fallen branch. But when he saw the open grave, he dropped his lantern. There, in plain view, was a coffin lid split in two, and inside, not a skeleton, but something far more disturbing. There were chains, real chains, rusted and still locked. Clara Whitcomb had been buried alive. The realization knocked the wind out of Harlan's chest. Her skeletal hands were raised, clawing at the lid, nails cracked and broken, jaw frozen in a silent scream. But the worst part, the part that would haunt him forever, was the scratch marks. They were deep, carved into the inside of the coffin in wild, desperate patterns, 13 deep slashes, a prisoner's last fight. Harlan ran back to town in a panic. Within hours, the mayor, the sheriff, and even Reverend Kane were standing over the grave in disbelief. No one spoke. The wind howled through the trees, and the open grave seemed to whisper something dark, something old. Why was she chained? Someone finally asked, and no one could answer. The body was carefully removed, and the local physician, Dr. Alan Hurst, performed a second examination. What he found was not the peaceful passing of a young woman. No, Clara had been sedated, her blood marked with traces of a plant-based paralytic rare but not unknown. She'd been pronounced dead by none other than Jonah Galloway himself, who'd claimed he had medical training from Baltimore. It was a lie. When confronted, the Galloways were calm, too calm. Margaret claimed it was a tragic misunderstanding. Jonah said the chains were a security measure in case of grave robbers, but the townsfolk didn't believe it, not anymore. That storm had torn open a coffin, but it had also shattered the illusion of the Galloways' innocence. The quiet suspicions, the odd disappearances, the unclaimed bodies, all of it began to make sense. That night, the grave did more than open. It screamed for justice. People who once defended the family began to speak out. Old debts were remembered, missing relatives were requestioned, and most importantly, the cemetery records, those kept only by the Galloways, were now demanded by the town council. They refused, so the sheriff got a warrant. That storm, sent by fate or by nature, had done what no man had been brave enough to do. It forced open the ground, forced open the truth, and in doing so, set in motion the downfall of the most terrifying family Bellevue had ever known. What had been buried with lies was now rising with the truth, and the storm was only the beginning. When the truth about the Galloway family began to surface, Bellevue was never the same again. The storm had ripped open more than just Clara Whitcomb's grave. It had torn apart the illusion of decency that surrounded the most quietly respected family in town. The revelation that a woman had been buried alive, with chains on her limbs and terror scratched into her coffin, was the crack that split open a vault of horrors. The townspeople, once cautious and reserved, were now gripped with a combination of grief, shame, and fury. For years they had trusted the Galloways, allowed them to handle their dead with little question, and paid them with coin and reverence. Now, that trust had become fuel for their collective guilt, and guilt demanded justice. Sheriff Thomas Brant, a war veteran and a man of few words, was not prepared for what he would find in the Galloway home. With a lawful warrant and a crowd of uneasy deputies, he entered the funeral home 2 days after the storm. The smell was not of rot, but of something worse, chemical decay, masking what lay hidden beneath the floorboards and locked cellar doors. What they discovered made strong men weep. Behind a false wall in the embalming room, there were ledgers, rows of names, coded notes, and crude sketches. But it wasn't just record-keeping. These were victim logs. Red ink marked those deemed viable, and a separate column labeled silent held initials of those who had no next of kin. These were the ones no one would miss. Below the funeral home was a narrow brick walled tunnel leading to a private chamber. Something never registered with the county. There they found several coffins that had never been buried. Some were empty. Others were not, and worse still, there were tools, not the kind used in embalming or burial. These were devices of restraint, control, and torment, shackles, gags, strange metal instruments no one could name but everyone instinctively feared. Jonah and Margaret Galloway hadn't just been undertakers. They had been predators, cloaked in ritual and false sanctity. The Galloways were arrested that same evening, the town nearly rioting outside the jailhouse as word spread. It wasn't long before a special circuit court was summoned from Harrisburg. The case made its way into newspapers as far as Boston and Richmond, the headlines dripping with horror: funeral home of death, the Galloway graves of Pennsylvania's house of silent screams. In court, neither Jonah nor Margaret showed remorse. Jonah remained stoic, reciting verses from a twisted form of scripture he had written himself, claiming he had saved souls, not ended lives. Margaret insisted they were chosen by God to separate the clean from the unclean. The judge called it madness, the jury called it murder, but it wasn't just about retribution, it was about restoration. Justice in Bellevue became more than a trial. The people of the town, once passive, began to rise with purpose. Families who had lost loved ones in unexplained ways demanded exhumations. Over a dozen graves were reopened, each one revealing inconsistencies: improper embalming, missing organs, some with signs of premortem trauma. Not all had been buried dead. That truth hung in the air like smoke. To honor the victims, the town built a new memorial garden, planting white lilies for each soul lost. There were 28 flowers, and beside each, a plaque that read simply, "Gone but not silent, never again." Bellevue's children began learning about the Galloway trial not as a tale of horror, but a lesson in vigilance, community, and conscience. Schools included a chapter in their Pennsylvania history books titled "The Silence That Killed and the Town That Spoke Up." The funeral home was torn down and the land was left untouched, except for a single black stone placed at its center, carved with the words, "Justice blooms where fear once ruled." Sheriff Brandt, who never sought recognition, was honored by the governor himself. He never spoke much about what he saw, only once saying, "Evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in polite homes and well-kept yards." Years later, a granddaughter of one of the victims became Bellevue's first female mayor. At her swearing-in, she looked at the crowd and said, "We were not broken by what happened. We were awakened. Evil thrives in silence, and silence is no longer welcome here." What the Galloways tried to bury was not just bodies, but the truth. Yet it rose. Through storm and sorrow, justice had found its voice, and in that voice the town found healing. The dead cannot speak. They do not cry out, and they do not accuse. But in Bellevue, Pennsylvania, the dead found a way to tell the truth. Through torn soil, uncovered coffins, and the shattered silence of a grieving town, they spoke, and what they said changed everything. The Galloway family had once been trusted to care for the dead, to prepare them for a respectful farewell. Instead, they used the stillness of death as a cover for their crimes. But even in the grip of horror, even when silence had reigned for years, truth has a way of rising. And with it came one of the greatest lessons a community could ever learn. The dead are not gone if they still teach us something. What we learn from the dead is not always in words. It's in the quiet signs we overlook. Clara Whitcomb's unearthed coffin revealed a horror beyond comprehension: chains, scratch marks, and eyes that had likely opened in the dark. She became a teacher, though she never knew it. Her suffering illuminated the path toward justice. Her grave, once closed forever, became a classroom for the living. We often look away from the idea of death. We treat it with fear or formality. But in Bellevue, people were forced to confront it head-on, not as a passing moment, but as a mirror of society's values, vigilance, and vulnerability. The way we treat our dead reflects the kind of people we are, and the Galloways showed how easily that sacred duty can be desecrated when no one is watching. The first lesson from the dead is this: complacency is dangerous. Silence is deadly. Jonah and Margaret Galloway operated not just in shadows, but in plain sight. They hosted church dinners, offered discounted burials to the poor, and even led grief counseling meetings. But behind closed doors, they wore masks that kindness couldn't conceal forever. The community's failure was not only in being fooled, it was in not questioning the ease with which the Galloways dismissed uncomfortable questions. No family, no visitors, no need for embalming. These became common phrases and no one pushed back. That silence allowed evil to dig in its roots, and in their deaths, the victims taught Bellevue to listen better, ask more, and trust less blindly. Another powerful lesson came from the exhumed bodies, the ones that showed signs of struggle, resistance, and pain. These people, long thought to have passed peacefully, had in fact fought for their lives. In that fight, they left a message. Even in your weakest moment, your spirit can leave behind a trail of truth. That realization sparked a change. Families began talking more openly about death and final wishes. Neighbors started watching over one another, not in suspicion, but in compassionate awareness. Funeral homes across the state were reviewed, inspected, and certified with new standards. The dead had given Bellevue its wake-up call, and the town answered with transformation. Then there is the most uncomfortable yet profound truth the dead left behind. The capacity for darkness exists in even the most respectable faces. The Galloways were not drifters nor outcasts. They were educated, clean, and respected. But they harbored evil, and the realization that such evil could be present in those we greet every day forced Bellevue to look inward. How many other towns had monsters wearing smiles? How many other quiet corners of society had horrors hiding behind etiquette? It became a moment of collective reckoning, not only to punish but to prevent. Schools began teaching not just history but moral courage. Young people learned to speak up when things felt wrong. Churches emphasized discernment over blind trust. And families remembered their dead not just with flowers, but with renewed commitment to vigilance. But perhaps the most lasting lesson came in the way the town chose to remember its fallen. Instead of simply mourning, Bellevue chose to build a memorial garden, a small museum documenting the trial, a scholarship fund in honor of those whose names would never be forgotten. Each victim became more than a statistic. They became a pillar in the reconstruction of a more aware, compassionate, and determined society. As one inscription at the garden reads, "They were silent in death, but in our hearts they speak forever." What we learn from the dead is not only how they died, but what we must do to honor the lives they could no longer live. We learn courage, we learn accountability, we learn that even from the deepest darkness, light can emerge. If we dare to face the truth, carry the memory, and change our ways, the dead do not rise, but their impact does. And in Bellevue, they rose not as ghosts, but as guides, reminding the living, do not waste the lesson that was paid for in blood.